We'll go to Antoine, we'll come back to you, but I think question number 4 was a good transition point into question number 5, and which is the last question before we go into the message or the summary that you would like to offer for the Initiative for Equality. But the current question is, would anyone care to offer other observations about equity and sustainability for the benefit of the field here? And again, it was a good segue from question number 4 to question number 5.
Well, yeah, I agree with Catherine. I think that there needs to be, just in the field of design and architecture, we need to return to that much more broad base of understanding that we're designing places that people are actually going to go into and use, and not just get photographed and take wonderful pictures for. And so sometimes we have to have a firmer appreciation for the social ramifications therein. But additionally, and I think the gentleman here brought up an excellent point, a lot of these kinds of conversations can sometimes get lost in academia because either we don't have the ability or the capacity to kind of make them practical, right? How do we make these quote unquote real projects? And a lot of that comes down to either political will and or cash, right? How do we have much more of a say in the development and the realization of these things? You brought up the Carlton Eley project at 18th and Vine. Carlton Eley also did a smaller master plan for a neighborhood in Houston known as the 4th Ward, right? And 4th Ward has historically been an African-American community in Houston. Depending upon who you ask, they were the first black community in Houston, right? However, since their study, that community has essentially been squeezed out because of gentrification in the city. And so you have 2 studies in 2 historical neighborhoods in 2 different cities that both have a strong African-American cultural background, but had radically different present realities. One in Kansas City had the support and wherewithal, both financial and political, to become realized and be this jewel in the Midwest, quite frankly. And then the other, because of other machinations behind the scenes, had almost the exact opposite happen to it. And so, you know, I think it's incumbent upon us to not only have these discussions, but we have to be much more vested in the political realm, and quite frankly, the smoke-filled rooms some places in all these cities, to be able to realize some of these discussions, and as and be more than just that.
Okay. We had a question in the back, and I'm gonna try to connect the dots because you mentioned Kansas City and Houston. For those who aren't aware, given the fact that Carlton Eley is connected to both of those, and we've been talking about politics, in Kansas City, the reason why the Jazz District was created is because a city council member by the name of Emmanuel Cleaver said, hey guys, we need to preserve this story that's here. It's cool. Emmanuel Cleaver wasn't from Kansas City. He was born in Houston. He grew up in Houston. But he saw the value of this particular neighborhood in terms of the testament of what it said about African Americans in terms of history, sports, music. And so he felt it was important to take the time to preserve that. Councilman Cleaver became Mayor Cleaver. Mayor Cleaver became Congressman Cleaver. And so politics are a very much important part of the reality. But as I said earlier, it's not just about rules, it's also about priorities and values. And so Cleaver's value system was based on, hey, we need to be mindful of how do we, one, protect issues that are important towards the story of who we are, but also how do we find ways in order to spread development around, particularly to the neighborhoods that need them. And so those are some issues in terms of the backstory that are important towards what made the 18th and Vine Jazz District work as a case example.
Well, I think to tie it together, at least for me, from the New Orleans standpoint, we've had over the last year conversations with the Urban League of New Orleans, and we've started to discuss what it means to have culturally specific architectural languages, what it means to develop community benefits agreements that define the people within that neighborhood as the arbiters of how their neighborhood becomes developed. And so, as we start to talk about what it means to be to have equity in communities, it's about empowering not only the people that live there, but the people who are designing for them to stay involved beyond just the building itself, right? So how do we see that building go up and then come back to that community or be in that community consistently enough to understand how people utilize that space. So more importantly than the function, because the function is what we decide that space to be, but the use is completely different, right? A milk crate is used to carry milk to a specific place, but it may also be used as a basketball rim or a bike rack for somebody or something else. And so the point is that if we can actually get to a point where we as architects, as designers, can be more in tune with what the utilization is, we will eventually create a more equitable environment based on that.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. See, Kim's hand is up. Does anyone else have an observation before we move into really the last bit of this? We're actually at the 11:50 mark, which means this is supposed to be wrapping up. And I want to be respectful of everyone's time, but I want to make sure we do get through all the questions.
So speaking of New Orleans, one of the things I remember coming from one of the communities in New Orleans, I can't remember the exact person who said this, but this sort of came through some of our early seed conversations. And one of the other things I need to share about seed is that it really encourages community participation as one of the key criteria for becoming seed certified. But the quote from someone or a community within New Orleans, it says, "Anything about us without us isn't for us," and I think that's a really critical piece to the discussion about equity, because if you're talking about impacting someone's habitat, they should probably be a part of the conversation.
That's crazy.
That's all I have to say.
Okay. Anyone else on question number 5? Okay. It's 11:50. Give yourselves a round of applause. Again, as I said earlier, NOMA is the first professional association to participate in the field hearings on equity and sustainability. So this is a landmark event. And